Today, we're diving into a fascinating story from the Bible. We're going to see how a nation's perfectly designed spiritual blueprint can lead all the way to the tragic downfall of its very first king. This is the story of First Chronicles chapters 6 through 10, a powerful look at divine order and human chaos.
So I know what you might be thinking. Ancient lists of names, why should we care? And that's a fair question. At first glance, these chapters can feel like a dry genealogy report. But I promise you, hidden in those names is an incredible story about identity, order, and the massive consequences of stepping outside of God's plan. And it's probably more relevant than you think.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the spiritual foundation, the tribe of Levi. Then we'll see how the nation itself was built, tribe by tribe. After that, we'll zoom in on the royal line of Benjamin, watch the city of Jerusalem get a second chance, and then see it all come to a head with the tragic fall of a king.
Okay, let's jump in. The story really kicks off in chapter 6. But what's interesting is that before we hear about any kings or any battles, the text lays out the spiritual heart of the nation, the tribe of Levi. And that is totally on purpose. It's making a huge point right from the start. For Israel, everything had to be built on a foundation of worship. See, unlike the other tribes, the Levites didn't get a big chunk of land. Their inheritance was something different. It was a sacred responsibility. God himself chose them specifically to run the house of God, to be the spiritual backbone for the entire country.
And this wasn't some haphazard arrangement. Oh no, it was meticulously organized. Everything traces back to Levi's 3 sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Every single family had a specific lineage and a specific job to do, creating this perfectly structured system for the nation's spiritual life.
Let's break that down a bit. You had Aaron's descendants, who were the priests. Their job was absolutely crucial, making atonement for the people's sins. Then you had others, like the Kohathites, who were in charge of the service of song. Yep, they were the temple musicians and singers. Everybody had a vital, God-given role. So the big takeaway from chapter 6 is pretty clear. God has a specific design for how he wants to be approached. He values order, he values structure, and he values the faithful, dedicated service of his people, where every single person knows their part and plays it well. This is the blueprint for a healthy nation. All right, so once that spiritual core is established, the camera, so to speak, zooms out in chapter 7. Now, the text lays out the family trees of the other tribes, and this gives us a picture of the nation's identity and its raw physical strength. So we get the family histories for tribes like Issachar, Benjamin, Manasseh, and a few others. And remember, these are not just names on a page. They represent real families, a shared heritage, and the military might of a nation that's ready to stand its ground. And to give you a sense of that might, the numbers are staggering. Chapter 7 tells us that from the tribe of Issachar alone, there were 87,000 valiant men of might. That's a huge army from just one tribe. It shows this was a nation that was not only spiritually ordered, but also incredibly strong. Okay, now in chapter 8, the focus narrows a lot. Among all these powerful tribes, the narrative zooms in on one in particular, Benjamin, because it's from this tribe that Israel's very first king is going to come. And the line is drawn for us with perfect clarity. Chapter 8, verse 33 literally says, "And Ner begat Kish, and Kish begat Saul." You see? All these long lists of names have been funneling down, setting the stage for this one crucial person in Israel's history. You know, these genealogies are such a powerful reminder that none of us just exists in a vacuum. Every one of us is part of a family, a history, a heritage. And for an Israelite, that personal story was deeply connected to God's much bigger story for their nation. Then, in chapter 9, the perspective shifts again. We move from these somewhat abstract lists of names to a very real physical place, Jerusalem. This chapter is all about the people who came back to rebuild the holy city after being in exile in Babylon. It's a story of starting over. And look who came back. It was a mix of people from the big tribes like Judah and Benjamin, but also, and this is so important, the priests and the Levites. The community that returned was dead set on reestablishing not just the city walls, but the entire system of worship we saw laid out back in chapter 6. And again, the level of detail is just incredible. Verse 22 points out that there were 212 gatekeepers, or porters, who were specifically chosen for their role. It just drives home how meticulous the organization was and that every single job, no matter how small it might seem, was vital to the whole community.
And that brings us to the climax in chapter 10. After 9 chapters carefully building this beautiful picture of divine order, heritage, and service, the story takes a sudden, dark turn. We are about to witness the tragic consequence of human disorder in the fall of King Saul.
The scene is set on Mount Gilboa, the Philistines' attack, and that once mighty army of Israel, the one we saw with tens of thousands of valiant men, it just breaks and runs. The beautiful order we saw being built up begins to completely fall apart.
Saul gets wounded and he's cornered, and in his final moments he begs his own armor-bearer to kill him. Why? Not out of bravery, but because he's terrified of being captured and tortured by his enemies. It is a moment of pure, raw desperation. When his armor-bearer refuses, Saul takes his own life. The text creates this really stark, tragic contrast. While his sons die fighting the enemy, their king dies by his own hand. A deeply dishonorable end in that culture.
So why did this happen? Well, the Bible doesn't leave us guessing. Verses 13 and 14 give us a painfully precise diagnosis. Saul died for his transgression, for disobeying God's word, for consulting a medium instead of God, and ultimately for just failing to seek the Lord.
The final verdict is swift and decisive. Because of this profound disobedience, this turn from divine order to human disorder, God took the kingdom from Saul's family and turned it over to David. The story that began in those genealogies is now ready for its next chapter. And that leaves us with this final thought. We've gone all the way from the meticulous, life-giving structure of the priest service to the chaos and death that came from one king's disobedience. It really makes you ask the question, if following God's design brings life and purpose, what does our own disorder, our own turning away, invite into our lives?